Welcome back, friends. Tonight we're reading Harvest Gathering by Phoebe Cary. The last days of the summer. Bright and clear shines the warm sun down on the quiet land, where cornfields, thick and heavy in the ear, are slowly ripening for the laborer's hand. Seed time and harvest, since the bow was set, not vainly has man hoped your coming yet. To the quick rush of sickles, joyously, the reapers in the yellow wheat fields sung, and bound the pale sheaves of the ripened rye, when the first tassels of the maize were hung. That precious seed into the furrow cast earliest in springtime crowns the harvest last. Ever, when summer's sun burns faint and dim, and rare and few the pleasant days are given, when the sweet praise of our thanksgiving hymn makes beautiful music in the ear of heaven, I think of other harvests, whence the sound of singing comes not as the sheaves are bound. Not where the rice fields whiten in the sun, and the warm south casts down her yellow fruit, shout they the labors of the autumn done, for there oppression casts her deadly root, and they who sow and gather in that clime share not the treasures of the harvest time. God of the seasons, thou who didst ordain bread for the eater who shall plant the soil, how have they heard thee, who have forged the chain and built the dungeon for the sons of toil, burdening their hearts not with the voice of prayer, but the dull cries of almost dumb despair? They who would see that growth of wickedness planted, where now the peaceful prairie waves, and make the green paths of our wilderness red with the torn and bleeding feet of slaves, forbid it, heaven, and let the sharp axe be laid at the root of that most poison tree. Let us behold its deadly leaves begin a fainter shadow o'er the world to cast, and the long day that nursed its growth of sin wane to a sunset that shall be its last, so that the day star, rising from the sea, shall light a land whose children will be free. The end. It's finally sweater weather. I'm so excited. Recently, we've kind of had a spate of authors whose work is very much informed by their lives, and Phoebe Cary continues in that tradition. Yay! Phoebe grew up with her sister Alice on a little farm in Ohio, and both of them grew up to be pretty lauded in their time as writers and authors. Alice Cary wrote a bunch of what we would now probably call YA, that might be older kid literature, about their time growing up in a small farm in Ohio. And she wrote mostly prose, and Phoebe kind of stuck to poetry, and in particular, she wrote a lot of hymns, or even maybe just poems that could be set to music. One of her most famous continues to be a hymn known either by its first line, One Sweetly Solemn Thought, or by the chorus, which is Nearer Home. And that was actually played at both her and Alice's funeral. Phoebe's work in general is kind of characterized as being sort of inspirational. There are a lot of her poems, and I'll link some down in the video description box along with, I always link, source material and a copy of the ebook down there, but I will include some of her other poetry as well. There's one called Don't Give Up, which is used very frequently in the middle grades, 6th, 7th grade in the United States. And both Phoebe and Alice were abolitionists, and they were in the the early women's rights movement. Phoebe actually edited Susan B. Anthony's paper for what I couldn't find out how long it was. It just said everywhere, it just kind of said a short while, which could mean almost anything. And Phoebe and Alice's professional work also kind of fit together very neatly, because this poem, Harvest Gathering, was published in their first big publication, which was together the poems of Alice and Phoebe Cary in 1849. This was spearheaded by Griswold, who, if you've watched any of our Edgar Allan Poe videos, you will know as the guy who took over Poe's estate and wrote a really nasty, scathing obituary about him. So 1849 was a real banger year for old Griswold. I feel like Harvest Gathering, the metaphor is kind of right there on the surface and very kind of easy to access. Initially, she starts off the poem kind of taking a page from Alice's playbook of using the whole farmland analogy to describe something. And you're kind of like, she almost kind of like leads you astray. She's like, oh, the harvest. I remember when we planted the seeds and now we're gonna harvest the seeds. And isn't it nice? And then in the third stanza, it kind of does like a little like record scratch moment. And it's like, except for those evil slavers who didn't plant their own crops and now they are evil slavers. It contrasts the plight of those who are righteously planting their own seeds and gathering their own crops. Both, I think that this is both intended to be like actual talking about like going out and, you know, planting corn. And also kind of the metaphorical crops, like the kind of you will reap what you'll sow kind of thing. And frequently in this era, we see people referring to, you know, the harvest of men, the harvest of souls, and she doesn't really get into that per se, but you can still kind of like read between the lines of the appealing to the creator. Like, what would the creator think of you for doing this kind of thing? Would you be reaped righteously up to heaven or elsewhere, perhaps? The line that always really gets me in this one is the line where she says that the slavers can no longer hear the righteous hymns because their ears are too full of the wails of despair. That's such a great image to me. And yeah, and I get the feeling that if you are not sympathetic to the abolitionist movement, you would kind of balk at that and, what do you mean their ears are too full of the shouts of despair? No, they're not. But the central metaphor of this poem is the idea of growth. And at the end, we get into the idea of this poisonous tree instead of just, you know, wheat, which you plant at the beginning of spring and then it grows and then you cut it down and then you move on. A tree you plant and it just keeps growing and growing and growing until you cut it down, even if it is poisonous. And toward the end, she kind of asserts, well, she does assert, that you need to cut this tree down that's grown from the blood of everyone else. Both the image of the star rising from the sea to light the land whose children shall be free. That's just a great line, first of all. But the day star is the sun. So she describes the sunset of the current day and then the rise of the new dawn. The sun is obviously very important if you are growing any kind of plant. Like, that's why that one doesn't look so hot, because it needs to go outside. But the sun is very, very important anytime you're growing any kind of crop. And her describing the dawn of the new day star. And I feel like the day star, very specifically, stars in general and navigating by stars was very important to the abolitionist movement at the time. So I feel like the choice of saying it's the day star and not the sunrise, I feel like that is a very deliberate choice on her part, because it's kind of like, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the stars. And as is characteristic of a lot of Phoebe's works, that kind of imagery of the rising sun and the new day dawning is a very inspirational one, a very aspirational one. So it kind of ties in very well with all of Phoebe's catalog. So let me know down below in the comments if I missed a metaphor. I probably did. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a Thursday. I'll see you guys next time.